Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. I do appreciate you being with me, and we're going to continue our discussion of the Olivet Discourse. We are focusing on Matthew 25, 1 to 13, and the parable of the coming of the Son of Man for the wedding, the five wise, the five foolish virgins. As I have stated repeatedly, if it can be demonstrated that Matthew 25, 1 to 13 is focused on the events of the first century, events that were imminent, events that were to take place soon, quickly, shortly, near, etc., then that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Olivet Discourse is not divided into two subjects. It's not about AD 70 plus some imaginary coming of the Lord at the end of the current Christian age. And by the way, another quick aside, let's not forget, the Bible affirms that the Christian age is without end. Christ's rule on the throne of David as a priest is unending. So it's kind of tough to talk about and focus on some yet future coming of the Lord at the end of the current Christian age. It doesn't work. So anyway, I have been sharing with you, and we've been focused over the last few weeks on the statement that Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like. So there is a conflation between the coming of the Lord for the kingdom and in the kingdom and the coming of the Lord for the wedding. Those two tenets, those two elements and motifs simply cannot be divorced. Now, what that means is, and this is a tremendous difficulty for the futurist view, if Christ has not come, the wedding hasn't taken place. Do we want to go there? If Christ has not come, the church has not been presented to him, as Ephesians 5, 25 and 26 says, it was to be at his parousia. And so that means that we have the longest betrothal period in the history of the world. Pardon me. A betrothal of so far 2,000 years. And that's simply untenable. Okay, so I have been sharing with you this motif of the interrelationship between the coming of the Lord and the coming of the kingdom. And how these concepts, how these motifs are absolutely indivisible. And so I want to call your attention, and I'm going to go there, and I'm going to read the text instead of quoting it. Not because I couldn't quote it, but anyway. Paul says, writing to Timothy, I charge thee therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who will, now that word will is from the Greek word mello, and mello in the infinitive, according to the Blas de Brunner Greek grammar, item number 356, says, mello with the infinitive indicates imminence. More on that momentarily. Now that means that Christ was ready, more on that. He was imminently about to judge the living and the dead. Now I think everyone will agree that the judgment of the living and the dead is the time of the resurrection. Time of the resurrection is the time of the wedding. Remember, back in Hosea when God divorced Israel, he put her to death. And he departed. But he said in the last days, he would return, he would remarry her, he would raise her from the dead. But it's pretty clearly not biological death that is in view. Here we have the very depiction of that. Now keep in mind, folks, what I've said repeatedly, Paul's doctrine of eschatology, Paul's doctrine of the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, was taken directly from God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. If we miss that, we've missed the narrative. So whatever else we might think about 2 Timothy chapter 4:1, it must be viewed through the prism of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Now, let's look closer. I charge thee therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who is about to judge the living and the dead, watch this, at his appearing and kingdom. Appearing, that's, Epiphany, if memory serves me correctly, and kingdom. Once again, kingdom, parousia, interlinked. You cannot divorce them from one another. That means when Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is like the coming of the Son of Man and is for the wedding. These are not divisible elements. These are not asynchronous elements. These are synchronous, virtually synonymous concepts. Now, I want you to notice, once again, that this appearing and the kingdom, once again, go hand in hand, and they were about to take place. Now, I know there's a lot of controversy about the Greek word mello. The opponents of covenant eschatology just absolutely love to try to destroy the force, the imminence of mello with the infinitive. Boy, pardon me, they'll go off on a tangent and they'll say, well, you see, it can be a paraphrastic statement for a simple future. Or it can be a paraphrastic statement concerning the certainty of something. Some have gone so far as to say, mello only indicates imminence if the event was going to take place within just a day or two. Now look, folks, you cannot find that definition in any lexicon. Period. You cannot find that claim in any commentary that I'm aware of, certainly. It is a contrived, invented claim with no linguistic, no lexicographical, and no commentary support for it. It's literally created out of thin air. But that's what some people have to do to try to find fault with covenant eschatology. They have to make things up out of thin air. Now, I want to do a comparison and to connect the dots between 2 Timothy chapter 4 and 1 Peter chapter 4. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul said Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. Over in 1 Peter, Peter said that Christ was ready, from the Greek word tetoimos. Now, the Greek word tetoimos can mean one of two different things, or it can combine those two things. Number one, morally prepared. Number two, temporally ready. Or it can mean both. A bride who was adorned for her husband was both morally prepared and temporally ready for the wedding, right? And that's the imagery that's given in Revelation chapter 21 with the New Jerusalem coming down from God out of heaven, adorned as a bride, or as a bride adorned for her husband. Hetoimos, ready for her husband. So, here in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 5, Peter said that Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. Well, that's the living and the dead of 2 Timothy chapter 4. All right? Now watch. In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7, Peter says, the end of all things has drawn near. Pardon me. Well, let me ask you a question. Is the resurrection at the time of the end? Well, according to Paul, it was in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 19 and following, when he talked about Christ as the first fruits. Afterward, those who are Christ at his coming, then comes the end. It's not a different end. I mean, after all, it's the judgment of the living and the dead, which is the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. Thus, the end of 1 Corinthians 15 is the end of 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7, and Peter affirmed in the clearest words possible, the end of all things has drawn near. But then, catch the power of this, In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 17, Peter says, the time has come for the judgment to begin at the house of God. Now let's break this down just a tiny bit. The time, it is literally the appointed time. From the Greek word kairos, which means designated or appointed time. But he doesn't use kairos without the definite article. So it is literally the appointed time. And then he says for, pardon me, the judgment. Well, guess what? Peter uses what is known as the anaphoric article. Now, the anaphoric article, according to Daniel Wallace, highly, highly recognized and honored Greek grammarian, the anaphoric article is by far the preponderant use of the definite article in the New Testament. And here's what the anaphoric article means. Okay, a writer or a speaker introduces a subject. Later on in his discussion, he uses the definite article. His use of the definite article in his discussion points the reader or the listener directly back to his previous discussion. Okay, that means that the judgment of verse 17 is pointing us back to the previous discussion of the judgment. What judgment is that? Oh, the judgment of the living and the dead. The resurrection, which is the time of the wedding. Now what that means is, ladies and gentlemen, is that Peter in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 17 was saying that the appointed, divinely designated time for the judgment of the living and the dead had arrived 2,000 years ago. Now watch this. If it's true that the coming of the Son of Man for the wedding in Matthew 25 is the time of the coming of the Son of Man for the judgment of the living and the dead, and the great majority of commentators say that's true, then since Paul said Christ was about to judge the living and the dead, and when Peter said the time had arrived for the judgment of the living and the dead, then that means that the coming of the Son of Man for the wedding in Matthew 25, the time had arrived when Paul and Peter wrote their epistles later in that generation. And that means Matthew 25 cannot be divorced from AD 70. And the great majority of the futurist interpretations of the Olivet Discourse simply vanish in a cloud of smoke. Thank you for joining me for this morning's morning music. Hey, don't forget, we're running out of time in March for you to take advantage of my fantastic 3-book special. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Click on the banner at the very top of the page. Save yourself almost $25. Okay? Thanks again for joining me. I'll see you on the flip side.